My name is Leah Jennings, and I've been working at Warner Services Company for exactly 4 years, 2 months, and 17 days. Not that I'm keeping score or anything, but when you're a senior financial analyst with a photographic memory for numbers and a borderline obsession with Excel spreadsheets, you notice these milestones. Warner Services Company isn't your typical corporate powerhouse. We're a mid-sized consulting firm that helps other companies maximize operational efficiency. Think of us as the Marie Kondo of the business world, except instead of asking if something sparks joy, we ask if it sparks profit. The irony of what happened next is not lost on me. Our CFO, Benjamin Hartwell, was one of those executives who flaunted his MBA from Wharton like a medal. He had that kind of confidence that only comes from never being wrong, mainly because he surrounded himself with people too intimidated to challenge him. His corner office overlooked the city, and he had this habit of standing at the window with his hands clasped behind his back as if surveying his kingdom. I'd been part of the quarterly audit team for 3 years straight. My colleagues often joked that I could spot an error from 3 spreadsheets away, blindfolded. It wasn't just a job, it was my calling. Numbers don't lie, people do, and in a world full of creative accounting and hopeful thinking, someone had to be the voice of reason. The audit team was small but formidable. Myself, 2 other analysts, and a rotating roster of external consultants. We'd spend weeks scrutinizing financial records, operational reports, and compliance documentation. It was painstaking work that demanded patience, a keen eye for detail, and the ability to discern patterns where others only saw chaos. The bomb hit on a Tuesday morning in October. I was at my cubicle, 3 cups of coffee deep into my analysis of the third quarter procurement reports, when Hartwell's assistant knocked on my partition. "Mr. Hartwell wants to see you in his office," she said, her voice carrying that unmistakable tone that signaled this wasn't good news. I saved my work, muscle memory from years of interruptions, and made my way to the executive floor. Hartwell was standing at his window naturally, wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. He didn't turn when I entered. "Leah," he said, his voice dripping with the patronizing tone I had learned to despise. "I've been reviewing the audit team composition for Q4, and I've decided to make some adjustments." My stomach sank. In corporate code, adjustments never meant good news. Adjustments meant someone was being fired, demoted, or, in my case, sidelined. "We need someone with sharper instincts leading the charge this quarter," he continued, finally spinning to face me. That's when I noticed it. The smirk. Not just any smirk, but the exact type that said he was savoring this moment far too much. Thompson would be taking over my responsibilities on the audit team. Thompson, Kevin Thompson, the golden boy hired 6 months ago straight out of some prestigious finance program. He had all the credentials, but none of the experience. He could talk a good game in meetings, tossing around buzzwords like synergy and actionable insights. But I'd seen his spreadsheets. They were disasters waiting to happen. "I understand," I said, keeping my voice steady. What I wanted to say was that this was a mistake that would cost him dearly, but I'd learned long ago that challenging Benjamin Hartwell in his own office was career suicide. "I'm sure you do," he replied, that smirk widening. "Your attention to detail is adequate, but we need someone who can see the bigger picture, someone who understands the strategic implications of our findings." The dismissal was clear. I was being benched, relegated to routine financial analysis, while Thompson took over the most critical audit of the year. Walking back to my desk, I felt that familiar burn of injustice in my chest, but I also felt something else, a cold, calculating calm. Because here's the thing about being a financial analyst with a photographic memory. You remember everything. Every conversation, every warning sign, every red flag that others choose to ignore. The next 3 days became a masterclass in professional restraint. I watched from the sidelines as Thompson assembled his new audit team, bringing in fresh faces and discarding the institutional knowledge it had taken years to build. He strutted around the office like a peacock, talking about innovative approaches and paradigm shifts in audit methodology. Meanwhile, I kept my head down and focused on my regular work. But here's the thing. When you've been doing financial analysis as long as I have, you develop what I call peripheral vision. You can't help noticing when numbers don't add up, even when they're technically no longer your responsibility. And the numbers at Warner Services Company were definitely not adding up. It started with small things: procurement contracts that seemed inflated, vendor payments that didn't match services rendered, travel expenses defying logic and geography. Individually, these discrepancies might have been explained as clerical errors or accounting quirks, but collectively, they painted a picture that made my blood run cold. Someone was embezzling money from Warner Services Company. A lot of money. I'd first noticed the pattern 3 weeks ago while preparing for what I thought would be my final audit. The inconsistencies were subtle, the kind that slip past a cursory review but stand out like neon signs to someone who knows what to look for. I'd started compiling a list of questionable transactions, planning to present my findings to the audit team. Then I got benched. Now, sitting at my desk on Wednesday afternoon, I faced an ethical dilemma that would make philosophy professors weep. I had information that could save Warner Services Company from a potential financial disaster, but I also had a CFO who had made it crystal clear my insights weren't valued. The professional move would have been to approach Thompson, share my concerns, and let him take credit for uncovering the fraud. But every time I looked at his smug face, every time I heard him dismiss years of institutional knowledge as outdated thinking, my resolve hardened. I decided to take a different approach: document everything, build an ironclad case, and wait. If Thompson and his team were as sharp as Hartwell claimed, they'd spot the discrepancies on their own. If they weren't, sometimes the best lessons are learned the hard way. Wednesday evening, I stayed late in the office. The building was mostly empty, just the security guard and a few workaholics like me. I pulled up the financial records I'd been analyzing and began cross-referencing them with the procurement database, the vendor management system, and the expense reporting platform. What I found made my hands shake. The embezzlement wasn't just happening, it was accelerating. Someone had been siphoning money from Warner Services Company for at least 18 months, using a sophisticated network of shell companies and fraudulent invoices. The amounts were staggering. Nearly $2 million had been stolen, and the theft was growing in both frequency and boldness. Worse, the pattern suggested that whoever was behind this had intimate knowledge of our internal controls and audit procedures. This wasn't some opportunistic employee taking petty cash. This was a calculated, long-term operation carried out by someone with significant access to our financial systems. By Thursday morning, I had compiled a comprehensive report detailing the entire scheme: 23 pages of evidence, complete with transaction logs, vendor verification records, and a timeline showing exactly how the money had been diverted. It was bulletproof, the kind of analysis that would make prosecutors salivate and auditors weep with joy. I printed a single copy and locked it in my desk drawer. Then I waited. Thursday came and went. Thompson's team busied themselves with interviews and reviewing high-level financial statements, showing no signs of noticing the fraud. I watched them work, methodically focused on all the wrong things, chasing compliance issues and procedural audits while missing the forest for the trees. Friday afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I cornered Thompson at the coffee machine, forcing casual into my tone. "How's the audit going?" I asked, stirring sugar with more force than necessary. "Great," he replied, brimming with confidence. "We're really revolutionizing the process. Hartwell is impressed with our efficiency." "Finding anything interesting?" I probed. He shrugged. "The usual. Some vendor contracts that could be renegotiated, a few expense categories that seem bloated. Nothing major. Nothing major. $2 million in theft, and he called it nothing major. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood. Monday morning arrived like a thunderclap. I was reviewing quarterly projections when the unmistakable sound of Benjamin Hartwell's voice echoed through the office, shouting, that particular pitch that meant someone was about to get fired. "What do you mean you didn't catch this? How is this possible?" I looked up to see Hartwell storming through the office, his face red with a mix of anger and panic. Thompson trailed behind him, looking like a deer caught in headlights, clutching a folder I assumed contained whatever had triggered the meltdown. They disappeared into the conference room, and within minutes, the entire audit team was summoned. Through the glass walls, I watched the meeting unfold like a silent movie. Hartwell gesticulated wildly, pointing at documents spread across the table, while Thompson defended himself with flailing hands. The rest of the team sat in stunned silence. That's when I saw them. A woman in a sharp business suit entering the building, followed by two men in equally serious attire. They had that unmistakable presence of external auditors, the kind called in when internal controls have catastrophically failed. My phone rang. It was Hartwell's assistant. "Mr. Hartwell wants to see you immediately," she said, her voice tight with stress. I saved my work, grabbed my coffee, and walked to the conference room with the measured pace of someone who knew exactly what was coming. When I entered, the silence was deafening. Hartwell stood at the head of the table, hands pressed flat against the surface, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. "Leah," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "we've just discovered that Warner Services Company has been the victim of significant financial fraud. Nearly $2 million have been embezzled over the past 18 months. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "That's terrible news. The external auditors arrived this morning after receiving an anonymous tip. They've been reviewing our records for the past 3 hours. He paused, eyes boring into mine. They found discrepancies that should have been caught months ago. The room was so quiet I could hear the air conditioning humming. Thompson stared at his hands, probably calculating how this would affect his career trajectory. The other team members avoided eye contact with Hartwell. "Here's what I don't understand," he continued, his voice rising. "How did a team of external auditors find in 3 hours what our internal audit team missed entirely?" That's when he exploded. "Why didn't you warn us about this?" he screamed, composure finally cracking. "You've been analyzing these records for months. How did you miss $2 million in theft?" The irony was so thick it could have been sliced with a knife. I could have pointed out that I'd been removed from the audit team precisely because my instincts weren't considered sharp enough. I could have mentioned that I had tried to raise concerns about anomalies in the financial records. I could have pulled out the comprehensive report I'd compiled and dropped it on the table like a bombshell. Instead, I took a sip of my coffee and said, "I wasn't on the audit team." The silence that followed made my ears ring. Hartwell's face went through a fascinating color progression from red to purple to an alarming shade of gray. Thompson looked like he wanted to vanish into the conference room carpet. "What did you say?" Hartwell whispered. "I said I wasn't on the audit team," I repeated, voice steady and clear. "You removed me 3 days ago, remember? You said you needed someone with sharper instincts." The external auditors, sitting quietly at the far end of the table, exchanged glances. The lead auditor, a woman with steel gray hair and eyes like a hawk, cleared her throat. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "Are you saying Ms. Jennings was removed from the audit team just before this quarterly review?" Hartwell's jaw worked silently for a moment. "That's correct. We restructured the team to bring in fresh perspectives." "I see," the auditor said, making a note on her pad. "And Ms. Jennings, how long had you been part of the audit team prior to this change?" 3 years, I replied. "I've been conducting quarterly audits since 2021. "And in your previous audits, Did you identify any concerns about the financial discrepancies we've uncovered today? This was the moment, the crossroads where I could either take the high road or watch everything burn. I thought about Hartwell's smirk, Thompson's arrogant dismissal of institutional knowledge, and the 3 days I'd spent watching them stumble while sitting on information that could have prevented this disaster. I had identified some concerning patterns, I said carefully, but I was removed from the team before I could complete my analysis. The lead auditor leaned forward. What kind of patterns? I stood and walked to my desk, retrieving the folder I had locked away. When I returned, I placed it on the table in front of the external auditors. 23 pages of documented discrepancies, cross-referenced with vendor records and expense reports. I compiled this analysis over the past week after noticing irregularities in the Q3 financial statements, I said. The auditor scanned the first page, eyebrows rising incrementally. This is comprehensive. When did you complete this analysis? Thursday evening. And you didn't share this with anyone? I looked directly at Hartwell. I was told that my instincts weren't sharp enough to be valuable to the audit process. The room erupted. Thompson protested that he hadn't been given access to the information. Hartwell shouted about insubordination and company loyalty. Other team members talked over each other, trying to distance themselves from the disaster. But the external auditors kept reading, expressions growing graver with each page. Finally, the lead auditor closed the folder and looked up. Ms. Jennings, this analysis would have detected the fraud scheme before it reached critical levels. If this information had been acted upon when you first identified these patterns, Warner Services Company could have prevented significant financial losses. The silence was deafening. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Thompson was reassigned to a junior analyst position, his dreams of rapid advancement crushed under professional incompetence. Other audit team members received written warnings and mandatory retraining. Benjamin Hartwell was quietly asked to resign, his Wharton MBA unable to shield him from the consequences of his arrogance. I was promoted to senior financial analyst, given oversight of the entire audit department, and personally thanked by the board for my diligence and integrity. Though they didn't mention the 3 days I'd spent watching the company bleed money while my warnings went unheeded. The embezzlement case was handed over to law enforcement, and within 6 months, they arrested the perpetrator, a mid-level procurement manager exploiting weaknesses in our vendor verification process. My analysis had provided the roadmap that made prosecution possible. But the most satisfying moment came during my first meeting as the new audit department head. I was standing in what used to be Hartwell's office, looking out at the city, when Thompson knocked. "Leah," he said, voice humble in a way I'd never heard before. "I wanted to apologize. I should have listened to your concerns." I turned to face him, recalling his dismissive attitude just weeks earlier. "The thing about sharp instincts, Kevin," I said, "is that they're only valuable if you're willing to act on them." He nodded, accepting the rebuke with grace. I've learned that lesson the hard way. As he left, I reflected on the strange turns professional life can take. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't proving you're right. It's watching others prove that you were right all along. Here's the thing about being underestimated in the corporate world. It's simultaneously the most frustrating and most powerful position you can occupy. When people dismiss your expertise, they give you the ultimate gift, the element of surprise. I could have prevented Warner Services Company's financial disaster. I could have saved jobs, preserved reputations, and protected the company's stability. But sometimes the most important lessons are learned through consequences rather than warnings. If you're watching this and find yourself in a similar position, if you're the person with sharp instincts being told you're not sharp enough, document everything. Stay professional. And when the moment comes, be ready to let your work speak for itself. Because in the end, numbers don't lie. People do. And the truth has a way of surfacing, especially when you know where to look. Trust your instincts. they're probably sharper than you think.